Hello and welcome to the 23rd episode of Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark with my co-host Benjamin Parkins.
Hey there.
Hey. So first things first, Western separatism. The big issue. Already Danielle Smith, immediately post-election, made a decision to lower the number of necessary votes to call a referendum on secession, on separation. In many ways, the people of the West, people in Alberta, they remind me of a situation that one finds in actually an old documentary from 2019 by Greta Thunberg, when she was talking to Polish coal miners. And they said to her this rather funny thing. They said, we'll believe in climate change if there's kind of a transitional package for us as coal miners. As in, if you're going to sort of end our industry and replace us and leave us effectively through these net zero plans to economic destitution, you have to have a transitional plan for us. This overdetermination of a climate event by the social is, to me, the right order in political affairs. I think that they were being tremendously accurate. And again, there's this almost strange, borderline psychotic statement. We will believe in this really happening event.
Right.
And I think that the West, Alberta in particular, are in a similar situation. And maybe they ought to be reminded of it. I don't know that their attachment to their oil and gas industry extends beyond the social benefits of that economy. And obviously there's a question, how much do you sell to this economy if it comes at the expense now of national unity? And is it worth propping up global commodity markets? Is the oil and gas industry the same thing as the commodity market that organizes and regulates energy production in this country? Let's be honest, the value of the oil and gas industry comes from the global economics and the global markets that produce the extraordinary value of crude and other oil and energy products. It has very little to do with the use of energy. There's a presumption that the energy is used. There's a presumption that this energy is really important, just like houses were really important before the crash of 2008. We rarely allow ourselves much perspective when it comes to deciding which social system we want to be in, even when, again, the evidence is staring us in the face. In this case, it's not even an environmental question. This is a collapse, again, of the Canadian Confederation, or risking the Canadian Confederation, in order really to maintain a partnership with the Americans that might not necessarily last.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's basically, I mean, there's a few things there, which is that the oil is only worth so much insofar as this commodity market exists for it. It's not that, well, Canada is really well positioned because we can hoard oil, and without it, the tractors that American farmers use won't be able to go somewhere. That's not really how the value of the oil is determined right now. I mean, there's also what we've talked about many times before, which is the fact that we don't do a lot of things to oil. We extract it, but we don't necessarily refine it or package it or ship it or do all these other things that are actually done oftentimes by the states. And I think that people miss that sometimes. I think there's this assumption that there's an inherent value to this thing because it's used to do work, basically. And that's not really the reason why it's valuable at this point. And we may be moving away from that. I mean, Mark Carney often talks about, basically moving past markets or not, having market sentiments. And so, yeah, I think that there's two things there, which is that, the people in the West, number one, they actually do have this real value that exists, the productive value of it, in as much as they actually experience it, right? They have people who work on the rigs. Their house is paid for via people who work in the oil industry. There's obviously tons of manufacturing that surrounds that. There's research positions. There are chemists on oil rigs, things like that. And so, the only people that really experience it outside of this financialized system are the people that are as intimately tied to it as possible. So for them, you can talk about that decouplement from the stock market or whatever, and you can tell them that, well, oil's actually not really worth anything inherently, blah, blah, blah. But if it actually is, if you actually experience that day to day, I mean, that's going to be really hard to get over. If, like you said, like the coal miners, there's no plan for beyond it. It's like, well, where am I going to work? I have a high school education, or I graduated from college, but it was 10 years ago, and I've only ever worked in the oil fields. What am I going to do? And then for people that are not close to that system, I mean, there are Ontarians and Quebec people, people here love to say, like, well, we have hydroelectric power. Why can we not just find hydroelectric power in the West? To make them understand that that's also not necessarily possible. And then in many cases, it's like, yeah, it's this way of life for somebody. And so you're asking them to reimagine their way of life. It's not as simple as quitting a job.
But it's precisely figuring out the way of life that is at stake here. And it's interesting you should mention Quebecers, because it's an excellent example of a culture and a community, a politicized peoples who have, in some cases, relatively conservative views, and yet are completely pro hydroelectric power. Why? Because of the economic independence it grants them.
Yeah.
If that's what is at stake here, we should take the challenge seriously of the Albertans and ask ourselves at least two questions. One, okay, how do we get economic independence, right? And two, is it possible? Is it possible within present institutions? Because, I mean, to sort of maybe interrogate a little bit this question of, is there an inherent value to oil? Well, we package it in a social system. We do make uses of it, which the value of which we sell. I mean, that's a good description of a financialized system. Financialized system is when you can take something like, you're going to pay your mortgage, you're going to buy a car, you're going to have your hydro bill, and we package that payment itself in another market, which is called a financial market in effect, where then people can buy and sell depending on the safety of one bundle of transactions or another.
Right.
And in that sense, people are selling the idea that those American farmers really need that oil. And in fact, we are, in so many respects, addicted to cheap energy. And we're so addicted to cheap energy, again, that we're willing to risk at least contemporary Canadian political society to get it. And the Albertans, are frustrated with the Trudeau government in particular, and Danielle Smith has specified her frustration with Trudeau in particular, but has described generally the sort of swath of liberal policies as anti-energy, anti-agriculture, and anti-development. So it throws us back into the question of, well, if we have to figure out a political scheme, a social scheme for the development of the resources that we have, but also those resources are not valuable in and of themselves, not beyond what we do with them. If we take public transit, great, and we're like the Quebecers, and we have tons of hydroelectricity, then that's our society. We repress the fact that we have there should be more variety in the decisions that we're allowed to make. And since we have this paradox between the fact that, no social system can fully ground itself in the given resource, while on the other hand, no resource means anything without a social system. So that's where, again, I sort of am on the side of the coal miners, the Polish coal miners, in that this is the arrangement right now.
Totally. Well, it's also, it's important for Quebecers, for example, to basically understand that we essentially got lucky. We got lucky that we were geographically located somewhere that was prime for something like building a massive dam that causes less damage, to the planet than oil does. But the idea that, well, our society was based on this moral superiority, and even if we had found oil in Quebec, Quebecers would not have drilled for oil, as if it's a total fantasy. To me, though, it's almost the way that it's treated. It really does seem like it. As if this is something that we didn't just stumble upon and get very lucky. That in fact, this society existed and then manifested this resource somehow. Of course, well, if they had found a giant reservoir in Alberta, they probably wouldn't have even built a dam. They're gas guzzling, truck driving, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, no, it obviously, it comes from the land. This is how culture works. The thing that is possible now, though, is that we basically have more control. It's not the medieval ages, right? Where if you're near a vein of copper or whatever, then that's what your family does, and that's what your kingdom is built around, and all these things. We have a little bit more mobility here. But of course, we'd have to present that first, because I don't think that it's possible for someone to understand that. I mean, how would you present that to someone? The idea that, well, we'll figure something out, but basically right now you have to give up your high paying job, or all these things, and that's the thing with these pipelines. I mean, like the bill that prevents new pipelines from being built. It's like, well, if this is what an entire region of one of the biggest countries on earth is reliant on this resource. If you're then telling them, people, by the way, who have currently basically everyone in the world has downward social mobility, right? Their dollar pays for less. If the only way for them to manifest some kind of upward social mobility is, well, if we build another pipeline, there will be more jobs, or the jobs that I have, this experience will be more in demand. I'll be able to negotiate for higher wages. I will be able to improve my quality of life. It's only seen through that lens. And then you're telling someone, well, you can't do it this way anymore. Of course, the reaction is going to be, well, I don't want you as the authority on what I can and cannot do. So rather than something that's preventative, it has to be something that's like basically presenting an alternative. And thus far, I feel like that's going to be what Carney actually has to do, is present an alternative, not sort of negotiate between, let's say, Quebec and Alberta, that, okay, we can have some pipelines, but not too many, and not. I just don't see that as the way that it plays out.
Well, people will sacrifice themselves for anything if they think it's worth sacrificing for. And right now, the Albertans are willing to sacrifice everything for, not just for their energy industry. Right, it is about economic independence. It is, on the one hand, about their freedom. That's how they see it. But their freedom has a huge cost. And maybe the cost of that freedom suggests that maybe it's not as free as they think. And this is the paradox, again, a little bit here, which is that, is it free if it's constrained to one choice? The only opportunity you have for freedom is that. And this is what frustrates me with many people on the right, in fact. And I'll mention Peterson. We spoke about him last episode. He's coming up again. He's important in this context. He believes in freedom, a kind of radical freedom with a counterbalancing radical responsibility. But it's funny that for him, you're only free if you're a conservative. And in this case, we might say you're only free if you're an oil rigger.
Right.
And I think this is where the coal miners in Poland have a leg up philosophically and politically over the oil riggers of Alberta, in that they're willing to say, well, if you can find the transition for us, if our livelihoods are not compromised, we'll follow you down this path. And for some people, it's just too naive to think about letting all of that energy sit there. And certainly Carney is, I would say, actually much more on that side than he is on the other side. And there is this social delay in that, and you already pointed to it, how can we get people to make a decision really for something that doesn't exist yet? The only thing you can do is remind them that politics is precisely the domain of decisions that haven't been made yet.
Right.
Politics is how you intervene into these kind of questions that cannot be grounded. These questions that, the only reason politics exists is because we can take on forms of responsibility whose kind of push, whose drive is really nothing but, okay, we choose this to be the next step in our society. And the most astonishing thing that happens is that even in our interactions with something as hard as the natural world, as substantial, as quote-unquote real as the natural world, because human beings transform the natural world,
right,
turn it into something in the first place, as if oil is maybe one of those nice things that really was just there, so we think. It only took 100 million years.
Right.
For it, we shouldn't be ignorant of these materialities. They should deeply inform our politics and deeply inform what is possible. I might just address now, what can Carney do? In terms of, okay, what is the way forward? Even if he kowtows to the very strong, hard-lined Alberta position, which is they want Bill C-69 gone, they want no environmental regulation, for the most part, any interruptive environmental regulation removed. But again, I'll go back to that quote from Danielle Smith of the idea that the Liberal policies have been anti-energy, anti-agriculture, anti-development. One should take a little bit of issue with this. no no lost love with the Trudeau Liberals.
Mm.
But the idea again here that we have in Alberta a system or a political society that has figured out agriculture, that has figured out energy, and that has figured out development, I think is frankly absurd. It is, you get what you pay for. It's cheap energy, it's cheap agriculture, and
Mm-hmm.
it's cheap development.
Mm-hmm.
And the world might be caught up in the radical expensiveness of maintaining the global system, of maintaining neoliberal practices, the extraordinary monetary costs behind that. Um, but all the more reason that we should be reflecting upon, okay, what agency do we basically have to decide what kind of agriculture we want? The most fatal assumption we make, and we make it in the energy sector, is that this is the only kind of energy we have. This is the only kind of way that we can think about this. We eat in one way and one way only. If someone can really tell me that, when they look at our grocery stores, the world of frozen pizzas and milk, that is the last word
Mm-hmm.
in human food systems, I would take that to be quite absurd. And so basically, one of the biggest issues facing Carney is these basic productivity issues in the Canadian economy, a fundamental lack of investment, something that Carney more than a decade ago called dead money, which is this phenomenon of basically corporations not wanting to spend money that they have. And what's happened considerably since 2020 is the repurchasing of shares, which is basically that corporations are not necessarily incentivized, least of all in the Canadian economy, to invest in a new line of productivity, find that new technology,
Mm.
find maybe that new kind of energy refinement. You mentioned like how involved is the Canadian energy sector in refinement. We do a certain amount of development, but certainly the Canadian economy as a whole is a highly staples-based, kind of more crude economy. We do less processing, but the point in all of this is that the Conservatives want to convince us a little bit that this missing technology, this missing innovation, and this missing productivity is due to, yes, okay, the setup of the global economy. And I mentioned the enormous monetary expense that we expend for the sake of maintaining the pure commercialism of the neoliberal system. Conservatives fail to mention that they're generally radical supporters of that neoliberal system. So are they simply ignorant of the fact that it costs trillions of dollars to maintain, that the era which existed for decades of low interest rates and high deficits, that's your effective cost of capital? What does that mean? It means that you get low interest rates, keeps money cheap, which is great, but it balances out with high deficits.
Mhm.
Enormous amounts of money spent by central banks and spent by governments. That is not an accidental partnership. So the same thing will affect in two levels here. The same thing affects the Albertans already in terms of what possible transition do they have? Do they even have any other options? No, they don't. That's the truth.
Mm.
So Carney is responsible to, vaguely to give them a different political option. And how many options does he have? Not necessarily very many. Because the productivity issue here that Carney conceives of as a financial problem, right? Dead money, which the Conservatives conceive of as a lack of innovation, in many ways, they're the same thing. They're the breakdown of the system that we have right now to move beyond anything but thinking of something as a commercial pursuit. Remember those financial markets where we do this other trade on the basis of people paying their mortgages, people paying their taxes, paying their energy bills. They're going to buy that car. Think about the radical conservatism of the neoliberal setup. It has to make sure that we're living these utterly stable lives so that speculative markets go crazy, so that they can have as much stability as possible. Of course, it's stealing from Paul to pay Peter, right? Because you are destabilizing the system at the same time as you're trying to, in confining all of its decision making, stabilize.
On another note, moving past Canada's sort of right wing is the UK's right wing element. Nigel Farage, who was formerly of UKIP and then was a big facilitator and supporter of Brexit, is now leading Britain's Reform Party, which is seeing huge gains in their upcoming elections. They are, interestingly enough, modeled off of Canada's former Reform Party, which hasn't existed for, I think it's like 20 years,
They
something like
merged with
that.
the
Yeah,
Conservatives.
merged with the Conservatives. But reason why they merged with the Conservatives is they were a real force. They were a genuine competitor. It's as if, in the past, let's say if the NDP had merged with the Liberals to form one super party, um, when the NDP was a real competitor, basically. Um, and yeah, it seems like conservatism and populism is, once again, I mean, it has been basically since 2008, but is on the rise. I know that in Europe we've sort of seen sometimes a shift um, the other way. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth talking about.
Oh, definitely. I mean, yeah. I mean, populism has been it's been here for I'd say almost 8 years now since the Trump victory in 2016.
Mm.
It's been a real thing, and a couple months before Trump was, of course, Brexit, which Nigel Farage was instrumental
Mhm.
in delivering to the British peoples. Yeah, no. In their most recent elections, a series of council elections across the United Kingdom, reformed what hundreds of seats in various municipalities, and there was even a by-election, which means a seat in the House of Commons,
Mhm.
and Reform took it from the standing Labour candidate. And one of the more interesting things about Nigel Farage is that he likes to use this word nationalisation,
Mhm.
and he talks about nationalising British steel. And this is we spoke about this last episode. We talk about it a lot, which is these fractures in the Conservative Party. And one of the problems is, and you've already hinted at it, is that the Reform was such a strong movement decades ago, back with Stephen Harper, and the Conservative Party had no choice but to say, okay, our program is outdated. We're going to absorb you, which the Reform thought was a reasonable transaction. Now, in some respects, I think that Canada would benefit if we had an even more radical right wing
Mm.
party. In that, okay, not just selfishly because it would eat into conservative gains, but more specifically because it would contribute a slightly different conceptuality to.
Right. Well, because there's a progressive element to the Reform Party. I mean, the idea of this nationalization of a populism that is obviously like right wing in flavor, but in substance is often fairly progressive and fairly left wing. Is using some of those tools, some of those classic more leftist positions, just as they become more obvious and more accessible.
But I mean, the topic requires a certain degree of precision. I mean, I think that the reason why you can have, if you actually go so far in either direction in the political spectrum, you can arrive on the other side, is because in many ways the political spectrum is one side.
Mm.
It's these positions are all effectively, in a weird way, on the same side. In that politics itself occurred. Modern politics occurred 250 years ago. The splitting of the House
Mhm.
and revolutionary France was literally the splitting of the House into right or left. People forget that. Politics as we have it now is the child of that strange insight that occurred in revolutionary France. And what was the purpose of it? Well, the purpose of it was to try and guarantee the radical freedom that the revolutionary Jacobins, among others, were trying to install in France at the time. And the division of the House meant a division of negotiations on the basis of a common emancipatory struggle.
Mhm.
And so really, maybe what we see with Farage is we see, yeah, if you go down the line of the alt-right, you actually get these crazy leftist policies. I think it's important to describe someone like Farage, among others. Trump is similar as like leftist without leftism.
Mhm.
And the question is, well, what do we do with these kinds of these fringe? They're fringe on the one hand that end up pointing out the truth of the system. Well, in some respects, we have a choice. Either we try and find the new balance, the new kind of radical political universal that will balance the scales, or we have to say, okay, the entire politics itself is not working.
Mm.
The very division of the House as a means of organizing and calculating human decision making is not good enough anymore. And yeah, nationalization is the most brilliant canary in the coal mine, not because it's a great policy. It's a policy that has favor in Britain. Again, if you go to Runcorn, that district where Reform just took a seat, many of those people just voted Labour in the last general election, which wasn't very long ago, where
Mhm.
Labour got an enormous amount of seats and the Tory party collapsed. And there's been excellent coverage on what these people have to say. And one, they feel utterly betrayed. Again, probably the coal miners in Poland felt utterly betrayed. I would like to believe that the Albertans feel utterly betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, they're kowtowing to a social system that I don't think gives them any freedom whatsoever, that imprisons them in having to maintain an energy sector, despite the fact that even if you get this, you get these kind of boom and bust towns, right? These scarred towns that are rich for a decade and then they're not rich at all.
Right.
70% of the oil industry in Canada is owned by foreign investors. That's not wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And if the political, we're sort of detouring back into Alberta, but if the political cost of that wealth is that you cannot have a functioning federal political system, what do you think Alberta's going to be in 20 years? They're not going to be a very interesting country in 20 years if they go down this route. They really should think a little bit more long term. But the same thing holds again for Farage. What do we do with Farage? Well, you have to say, no, take nationalization as evidence of something, as evidence that this is not just fracturing in political parties. This is fracturing in politics itself as a system. And nationalization will not save the British steel industry any more than protectionist policies will save the American economy. But they represent, without question, the populist reaction to neoliberalism. And Nigel Farage, who's a total free marketer, is utterly opposed to
Right.
neoliberalism.
That's what's really interesting. That's what's really interesting about that is that he in many respects would be much closer to someone like Pierre Poilievre, who would say, total free enterprise. If something is not working, let it die, whatever. But eventually, and I mean, this is probably honestly where Pierre went wrong. I mean, we're seeing it work so well for reform, is not saying, okay, the market is righteous, we should basically denationalize everything, right? Like Canada Post, which might go on strike again, which is interesting. We talked about that as part of our early episodes. If it's not working, it should die and be replaced by Amazon. Whereas Farage is saying, we all know that Amazon is terrible. And so we should, basically, I mean, nationalize Amazon rather than let Canada Post fail. It's like turn these things that are working, that employ many people, that are victim of boom and bust, turn them into something that is, kind of bulletproof, state-backed, all of these things, which, like you said, is not necessarily the right solution, but is evidence that these market-based societies basically are not working anymore. They require such a degree of intervention that people who would normally be total capitalist, free market, or even like whatever you want to call it, like libertarian capitalists, basically, are now saying no. The purpose of government basically is to intervene and make this thing work. Now, what we're saying is it's so fundamentally broken that these sort of band-aid policies are not going to work. But yeah, it should be taken almost at face value that if Nigel Farage is saying nationalize British steel, then you can still be a critic of his, and say, well, that's not going to work. But you should at least understand that if someone like him is saying that, then something is really wrong. It's as wrong as it seems, basically.
Well, it means that the political system is warping, and it's staring at itself. And we're going to have to make a choice about whether we want to double down on politics as a system or not. And is it the right solution? I mean, the problem is that the kind of power that the state does have is extraordinary. We see it under Trump. We saw it in pandemic. And the problem might just be that the political system as it exists right now can only generate a version of a nationalized economy which is perhaps too dictatorial in its form. We've had a history of social democracy, New Deal, other policies that have attempted to introduce a strong labor representation, using strong government, as you said, to provide a kind of bulletproofness to the work that people do day to day to keep the economy alive. The problem might just be, one, those things reached their pitch in the 70s and were violently replaced by neoliberalism. And that wasn't just the success of the persuasion of advocates of neoliberalism. There was a serious slowdown within 25 years of the post-war period. And nationalization, even in its leftist or right-wing variety, might not work. It might not be, in a sense, radical enough to overcome one market society, as you mentioned, on the one hand, but also the greater malaise in political decision making itself, we might not have the instrument. We might not have formulated the instrument yet for how to get through this kind of situation, which is the lesson we should take from Farage. When you get this painful and paradoxical coincidence of opposites, you should take a look at the system itself. It means that no matter which choice you make, you're going to get the same result. And we've seen this before. If the right wing are now socialists, and whenever a leftist party gets in, they're austerity, there's a warping here. That should be a jumping off point for rethinking the social conditions, not just of our politics, but we've already mentioned of our agriculture, of our energy industries. What do we really need? How much do we have to keep converting everything into a commercial transaction in order to lubricate the wheels of the global economy, so as to maintain the little fragile human freedom, the kind of dust mite that sits beside the factory engines and hopes to get a little bit of warmth. That's what we are right now. We're kind of dust mites who are convinced that the factory exists to warm us. The scary thing is that we have produced these factories, so to speak, the global economy, among other things, that, as far as I'm concerned, do not produce anything of substance. It's not an accident that we've become a financialized economy. When you cannot produce anything anymore, all you can do is sell back the fiction of production. That is the only way to save the system. To sell back that fiction of production. And you need two basic things. You need people willing to sell that fiction, whoever it is, in the energy sector and the automaking sector, whatever. And you also need compliant governments who are going to pump that system full of the monetary requirements to give it the necessary fake synthetic momentum to make it seem like, oh, but we're worth trillions of dollars, aren't we? Even as you reach the point where the monetary system itself is at risk, not unlike how our political system is at risk in its very form.
This has been Radical Priorities, episode 23. I'm Ben Parkins.
Hey, Clark.
Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.